Right. So what have we learned so far? We do a very quick summary. We had this uh, oh, I have to reorient myself a second. Yeah, it's a very quick summary. We started off this sugya here in Baba Batra with Rabbi Chanina, who went out to the towns and they asked him this question. That one pasuk said that the Beit HaMikdash of Shlomo was 60 amot in length and 20 in width and 3 in height, but then just a little bit later it says that the inside of the Dvir in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, it was 20 by 20 by 20 in height. So how could it be that the whole house was 30, but somehow the Kodesh HaKodeshim was only 20? And so he gives them this very interesting answer, and he says that it was only when it gives the measurements for the Kodesh Kodeshim, it only measured from the height of the Kruvim boards. So we know from elsewhere that the Kruvim stood 10 amot high, the Kruvim in Beit Shlomo. And then he says, and this teaches us that the space below was like the space above, but just like the space above didn't have anything in it, so also the space below didn't have anything in it. So, in other words, he understands the pasuk to be alluding to this idea. We know that the physical dimensions of the Kodesh HaKodeshim would have been 20 by 20 by 30, but we start to understand that there's something different about the reality of the Kodesh HaKodeshim that, as it were, the space below didn't. Because in the space below are the Kruvim and the Aron, and support to this, and as a support to this, he brought Rabbi Levi, and Rabbi Levi said that this is a Masoret B'Yadeinu Mi'Avotenu, that the place of the Aron and the Kruvim were not counted in the measure. Excuse me. And Tanya Nami Hachim, there's a Braita that also learns that the Aron that Moshe made, when it was, as the Rashbam explains, the Aron that Moshe made when it was put into the Kodesh HaKodeshim of Shlomo, it had, you could measure 10 amot in all directions. And this supports the idea that it didn't take up any space, explained, right? Because if you measured 10 amot in every direction, that leaves no space for the Aron itself. So we start to get this idea that the Aron and the Kruvim did not actually take up any space. Somehow they were there, but they weren't there, or they were there in spirit. But like I say, the only way I can imagine this somehow is they brought, when they built the temple, right, and it's just described in Malachim Aleph and in Divrei Hayamim, that they bring the Aron and the Kruvim into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. That's, that's written. But somehow once they are in there, it's as if they've entered into like a dimension, and so they're there and they're not there. Then Gemara, as follow-up to this, brings Rabbanai in the name of Shmuel that Kruvim b'neis hein omdim, that the Kruvim stood by way of an ace, and we understand that too, that the Kruvim themselves also were there and weren't there. They were somehow like, in this sense, like the Aron, that they take up any space. The only thing I'm not sure about, but it would say it would Vim didn't take up any space, and the Aron didn't take up any space. But it seems like the wings did take up space, right? That the way it's described, it seems things were still there, even though they're part of the Kruvim. Because you can measure above, right? In the beginning of the Sugya, Rabbi Hanina says that you can measure from the wings above 20 amot, and that's the measurement that's being brought in Malachim. So it seems like the wings were there, but but the Kruvim themselves didn't take up any space. Whatever that means. So I think last week then we looked at all of the attacks on this idea, various challenges to this idea, specifically about the Kruvim, but not about the Aron. In other words, nobody challenges this tradition that the Aron didn't take up any space, but there are challenges to this idea about the Kruvim, right? Matkifa Abaye says maybe Dilma Boltin Katana Gulin Habukaimi, maybe their wings were sticking out like that of a rooster, meaning that the body could still be there, and you could still get a measurement of 20 across from both sets of wings. Just to remind you, right? Because that was the issue Anai brought up. I'll just read this again quickly. Amar Rabbeinu Shmuel Kruvim b'nei Seinon Amar v'chamesh shemot knaf hakad v'chamesh shemot knaf hakruv hasheni 10 amot miktzot knafav v'yad ktzot knafav. So when the pasuk describes the Kruvim, it says that each of their wings was safe. So, and each of them had 2 wings, and the wingspan from tip to tip was 10. So if the wingspan was from tip to tip was 10, so where's the body of the Kruvim themselves? Where would that have been? Elishma mina b'nei seinon din. Rather, it teaches you that the body must have stood by way of a mace, meaning, as we explained, somehow it was not counted as part of the midah. So on that, we have these various attacks. We have biases Dilma Boltin Katarnakalina Abukaini. Maybe the wings come out from the center of their backs, and so that there was no space between the wings at all, and you could still have the body underneath the wings. And Matkifa Rava says Dilma Zeshelo Keneged Habukaini. Rava says, no, actually, you could even have the body in between the wings, but maybe they weren't standing right next to each other. Maybe one was a little forward and one was a little behind. And the wing, the right wing of, if you imagine, I'm thinking like this, if you imagine that you're standing in the back of the Kodesh HaKodeshim on the western wall, and you're looking forward at the Kruvim. So the one on the left, whose left wing is touching the northern wall, and his right wing is toward the center of the room. But then there's one, the next Kruv is in front of him, and their wings would be the right wing of the left Kruv would go past the tip of the left wing of the right crew, such that there would be space for them and their bodies. And then we have Matkifa Ravacha Bar Yaakov Dilma Bachsona Havukaini. Maybe they were all together just standing in a diagonal of the room, which would give them another roughly 8 amot, which would be plenty to have their bodies in between the wings. Then we have Rav Huna Bereder of Yeshuv, Dilma Beta Me Eli Ravath. Rav Huna understands maybe you don't have to change anything about our original vision of this, which would be 2 kruvim standing one next to each other, and their bodies would be in between the wings, but maybe at that height, 10 amot from ground, there's more space between the walls than 20. That when we counted, when the pasuk says that the Kodesh HaKodeshim is 20 by 20, was counting the floor space. But as you go up, the thickness of the wall gets smaller and smaller, so that by the time you get up to 10 amot, you might have however much more you have, right? Depending on the slope, you could have enough space for their wingspans, which would each be 10 plus whatever the width of their body is. Let's say it's another amah. So then it would be the total would then be, let's say, 22 amot, but maybe that's how wide the walls were at that point. We have Matkifa Rav Papa, the Dilma Mechav Habuchaifi Yadayu. Maybe you don't even have to say that. Maybe the walls were straight. Maybe they were standing next to each other. But maybe their hands were bent. That is, the tips of their wings were bent. And if they bend down enough, maybe on both sides, maybe even on one side, then again, you would save room. That would give you enough room to have the bodies in between the wings. And then finally we have Matkifa Ravashi, the Dilma Shalfufe Hadim Shafalfi. Maybe their wings were just one on top of the other. There are other perushim to these words, Shalfufe Hadim Shalfufe, but that's the Rashbam, it's nafal kanaf, like one wing is on another wing. Kadam shechoveket yadav, like a person who's grasping his own hands, like that, something like that. Anyway, so what's interesting about all of that is what we're left with in the sugya is that we still are going to say that the Aron of Moshe, when it was in Bayit Shel Shlomo, Bayit Rishon, it took up no space, less man depalid. Nobody disagrees with that point. And that particular point, just to remind you, the Raita, right? Tanya Nami Hafi, Aron Moshe Yeshlo Revach Eser Amot L'chol Ruach V'Ruach. So there's a Braita that specifically points this out about the Aron of Moshe when it was in Bayit Rishon, that it took up no space. But the idea of the hymn, this is what's interesting is that Rabbi Levi, so Rabbi Levi, Tema Rabbi Yochanan, so these are both Amoraim, and they say that this is a Masoret. And so you would think that challengeable, but none that's challenged. Right? All of these Amoraim are challenging this idea about the Kruvim. Maybe the Kruvim were still in fact there. Now, that brings us up to the last part of the Sugya, which we'll look at now. Ketzad hein omdim. How did they stand? This is referring to the Kruvim. How did they stand? So what does it mean? How they stand? Meaning, what was their position in the Kodesh HaKodeshim? Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. So this is a machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, who were, again, both Amoraim. They were Bar Plukta. They were Chaverim who often disagreed. First generation Amoraim. Chadamar Pneihem Ish El Achiv. So one of them said that their faces were one toward the other, right? Man toward his brother, right? They were facing each other. One says they were facing each other. The Chadamar Pneihem Labais. The other one says that their faces toward the house, presumably meaning that they were facing toward the Heichal. So now we'll break this down. Ulamanda Amar Pneihem Yishal Achiv, Hativ Ufneihem Labayit. So we'll ask a question. So and this I think you know, but I'll just point it out. There's a machokas here between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, where one says Pneihem Yishal Achiv and one says Pneihem Labayit, and it's the machokat is presented in this way because we don't know which of the rabbis said which opinion. One of them said one of them said the other. We know that they had this argument. We know that they each had, a differing opinion, but we don't know which one said which. Okay, so, and the Gemara here isn't going to try to, sometimes the Gemara can determine which one said which because of other statements they made. Here we're going to try to do that. We're just going to focus on the machloka. So according to whichever one said that they were facing one another, Pneihem Ish El Achiv, so we have a kasha on that. Haktiv ufneihem labayit. It says in the pasuk in Melachim, or actually in Divrei Hayamim, that they were facing the bayit. They were facing the heichal. So that Manda Amar can answer by saying lo kasha. It's not a difficulty. Kan bizman she'Yisrael osin ritzono shamakom, kan bizman she'ein osin ritzono shamakom. So here is the time when Israel was doing the will of God, and here is the time when Israel was not doing the will of God. So we have to understand what that means and how does that answer the question. We'll come back to. Just want to read now toward the end. So the one who says that they were facing the bayit, the hechal, haktiv, ufneihem yishal achiv, another pasuk in Shmot that says that they were facing one another. So he would answer by saying dimitzadade atdude, that they were positioned in a kind of sideways position. Titania, as we learn in a Braita, Kusager Amar, Kruvim Masetza Atzuim Hein. The Kruvim were Masetza Atzuim, Umitsudadim Kenehem Ketamid Haniftar Merabah. And their faces were a sense, looking to the side, like a student who's departing from his master. Okay, so this is all a bit unclear, but we're going to take a look at Sukkim and see if we can put it together with the Perush of the Rashban here. One of the things that's interesting to note is after we had this whole discussion about the Kruvim not taking up any space, and then we had all these challenges to challenge that notion that they could have taken up space. Now we're trying to determine in what way were they positioned. So it implies, perhaps, although not necessarily, that uh, that we could see their position, right? That the Kruvim, even though there was this masret that the Kruvim didn't take up any space, but you could still somehow see which way they were looking, which way they were positioned in such a way that their heads were looking in one way or the other. So it's all a little confusing, right? But that this part of the sugya is brought in the wake of everything discussed about the Kruvim, and we still want to know this. So it's not like somehow they were not invisible, presumably. Um, and I think we'll strengthen the argument in a moment. But according to this whole Masoret that they didn't take up any space, it heightens this mystery. Exactly what does it mean that they didn't take up any space, but nonetheless they were looking in one way or the other. So, so the first pasuk that's quoted here, Haktiv Pneihem Labai. So this is in Divrei Yamin Perek Bet, Divrei Yamin Bet Perek Gimel. 1 second. Okay, we'll have to come back to that. Okay, so we read through this before, but we'll just read some of the psukim now. So this parak is parallel. This parak in Divrei Yamin is parallel to Malachim Aleph Parak Vav, but there are some slight differences. So here, when we get to the discussion about the Kodesh HaKodeshim, we'll get up to here. Vayas b'Beit HaKodesh HaKodeshim Shnayim. So he, in other words, Shlomo made in the Kodesh HaKodeshim two kruvim, Masei Tzatzuim, Vayitzapu Otam Zahav. He made them a making of tzatzuim. So we saw the Targum and the Mefarshim understand tzatzuim here to be like the word tzatzaim with an aleph, meaning that they were like children, they were like offspring, and he covered them with gold. The chanfei hakruvim are kama motesrim. The width of the wings of the kruvim was 20 amot. Knaf echad la'amot chamesh, magad l'kir habayit. So one wing, which was 5 amot long, touched the wall of the bayit. V'kanaf aferet amot chamesh, magil l'chnaf ha'afer. And then the other wing of that same kruv was 5, and it reached to the wing of the other kruv. Knaf ha'kruv echad amot. And then we'll count from the other wall that the second kruv, the same thing. His wing touched the wall of the bayit. His other wing was and that would be the wing that touched the wing of the first kruv. Then it says, Kanfei kruvim ha'ele porsin amot esrim. So stands to reason that the wings of these kruvim, when they were spread out, they spread out over 20 amot. V'hem omdim al regleihem, they, the Kruvim, were standing on their legs, ufnehem labayit, and their faces were toward the bayit. Um, well, I'm going to wait to show you Rashi. I'll look at Rashi now. So, so that's the proof that Pneihem Labayit. That's what it says. But in contrast, when we look in Shmot and the description of the Aron is brought, and as then the description of the Kaporet, so it says, "V'asita kaporet zahav taor hamatayim b'chetzi arka, yama b'chetzi rachba." The kaporet was 2.5 amot by 1.5 amot, which is just enough to cover the aron. V'asita shnaim kruvim zahav, t'aseh otam. They were made from a single solid piece of gold. From the edges of the kaporet, which was covered in gold. You make a proof from this edge and another proof from this edge. Nina kaporet asu et kruvim al shnei ktzotav. You make the kruvim on both of its ends. On that. You make it from the kaporet on each of its ends. Apparently, right, that the idea is that the gold that covers the kaporet is going to be peace with the kruvim that are coming out of it. And the kruvim were spreading their wings above. Sochachim the kanfehem al kaporet. They were covering with their wings over the kaporet. Ufnehem ish el achiv, and their faces were one toward the other, right? A man toward his brother, right? They were facing each other. El hakaporet. They're facing each other to the kaporet, to Hupanei Kruvim. That their faces were also toward the kaporet. So that in itself raises a question. If we just look at that pasuk, we would also understand what that means, even without the difficulty from Divrei Hayamim. How can it be that they're looking at each other and they're also looking at the kaporet? It implies something about the way they were looking at that time. The Gemara here actually doesn't deal with that particular problem. It's dealt with elsewhere. Okay, we're going to leave that question. Okay, now, so these are the two psukim though that seem to contradict that the kruvim, when they're described in Shmot, are looking at each other. The kruvim that are described in Divrei Hayamim are looking at the Heichal. So if I think of it like this, so the kruvim of the Mishkan, they're like on top of the kaporet, and they're kind of facing each other. And the kruvim in Bayit Sheni are, like this. My hands are not proxies, but you got it right. They're facing outwards, and they're not facing each other. So one way to answer this question, what's the obvious answer to this problem? There's a simple answer to this problem, to say that these psukim are not contradicting each other. Well, what might that be?
The Keruvim are at a diagonal.
No, that's not a simple answer.
both Pesukim are referring to the Beit HaMikdash, not one the Mishkan and Beit HaMikdash, or both Beit HaMikdash.
So you're hitting on the answer. In other words, the book in Shmot is talking about the Mishkan.
The earlier
And
one is the Mishkan, and this is the Beit HaMikdash.
Right. In other words, I should be able to answer this question simply. I should say, what's the problem when when the order from the Mishkan was given, right? We're looking now in Shmot, in Parshat Truma. This is the tzivui to make the Mishkan. And Hashem is saying that when you make the kaporet, then you put the kruvim on top, and they're going to face one another. When we look in Melachim and in Divrei Hayamim, we know that Shlomo changed that, presumably based on a Masoret he had. We won't get into that now, but we do know from Sukkim Dafka in Divrei Hayamim that Hashem gave a kind of blueprint for Bayit Sheni to David HaMelech, which he then would have passed on to Shlomo. And so we know that there's a very big difference between Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni in this regard. That in Bayit Rishon there were two kruvim that were part of the kapara that came out of the kapara, and in Bayit, in the Mishkan we have the kruvim on top of the kapara. In Bayit Shel Shlomo we have these two huge kruvim that are not actually part of the Aron, and they're spreading their wings out from wall to wall. So the simple answer would be, kan b'mishkan, v'kan b'bayit shel Shlomo. And then I could say, I could ask questions on that. I could say, okay, so was it like that in the Mishkan, and why did it change in Bayit Shel Shlomo? That's a perfectly reasonable question. And by the same token, like, why was it that the kruvim were part of the Torah in Bayit Rishon? What happened to them in Mishkan? What happened to them in Bayit Shel Shlomo? Like, why weren't those kruvim there, and why were these other huge kruvim there? 1 second. You look at the Gemara. The Gemara is starting from. Second. What happened to my Gemara? Just a second. All of a sudden. But do you see the Gemara on the screen, or do you still see the Psukim on the screen? You don't see. So wait, let me cancel this. Now it came up again. All right, now we're Gemara, right? Okay. Okay, so the Gemara here, though, it's asking this is right. Let's go back now and look at the Gemara. So the Gemara says Ketzad Hein Omdim. So in what Tnucha, in what position were they standing? So Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, Chanamar Pneiam Yishal Achiv, Chanamar Pneiam L'Bayit. Now, when it's this Ketzad Hein Omdim, which kruvim are we talking? So until now, what kruvim have we in the Gemara? Until now, which kruvim were we talking about?
Beit HaMikdash.
Talking about the Beit HaMikdash. So presumably that would be the reasonable assumption here, that we can, like I said before, we're continuing on now with this discussion. So Ketzad Hein Rabbi Yochai, so one of them says they're facing one another, one of them says they're facing the bayit. So now, so let's see how the Rashbam understands this. It says Ufnehem Yishal Achiv B'Shel Moshe Ktiv. This is talking about that of Moshe. In other words, Pneihem Yishal Achiv, we saw that's referring to the pasuk in Shmot, and that's talking about the Kruvim of Moshe. And Pneihem Labayit, the Kruvim Shel Shlomo Ktiv B'Divrei Hayamim Tichtiv V'Hem Amdim Al Ragleihem Ufneihem Labayit. So that was the other pasuk that we saw in Divrei Hayamim. So he says explicitly, "Einan ka'otan shel Moshe shehein al hakaporet." These kruvim were not like the kruvim of Moshe, because the kruvim of Moshe were on the kaporet. The elu, these of Shlomo, al hakarka, they're staying on the ground. Shel eitz shemen hayu, they were made of eitz shemen. Zahav, and they were covered with gold, as it says in Lachi, as opposed to the Kruvim of Moshe, which were entirely made of gold. Right? So these are made of wood, and they're covered with gold. So we understand we're talking about two different sets of Kruvim when we talk about these psukim. So the Gemara says, so according to the one, it says, Pneihem Yishal Achiv, Haktiv Pneihem Labayit. So the Rashbam says, Haktiv Pneihem Labayit. And so he says, V'lo shna kruvim sha'al hakapor, V'lo shna sha'al hakarka, Ru'uyin hayu le'asot binyan echad. So he is filling in the Hava Amina of the Gemara. He's filling in what the Gemara seems to be assuming. That when the Gemara asking this question, it's saying that there's no difference between the kruvim that were on the kapara and between the ones that are on the kapara and the ones that are standing on the mount. And this is his perush. It's proper that they should be made in the same way. In other words, we have to add in, despite the fact that they are radically different. He's saying that nonetheless, in terms of this aspect of the Kruvim, we would assume that they were the same. Or to put it differently, we should assume that when Shlomo Kruvim for Bayit Rishon, that he would not have parted so dramatically from what is apparently a very central aspect of the Kruvim. So this is how I see it. That is, somehow, so when we're asking Ketzad Hein Omdim, how are they standing? What we really want to know, where were their faces facing to? That seems to be what the Gemara wants to know. Because apparently the Gemara understands that to be something so fundamental to the Kruvim, that should be the same, regardless of whether it's the Mishkan or Bayit Rishon. So even though the Gemara here doesn't tell us why Shlomo changed the Kruvim, but the assumption is that he should not have been able to change them so much. They're going to face differently than they did in the Mishkan. So even though none of that is really obvious, but this seems to be what the Gemara thinks, as the Rashbam explained. So that's our question. according to the one who says, so in other words, so how does this work? So we had Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, and each of them has a certain vision of the way the Kruvim were. And one of them says that one is facing one another, they're facing one another, and the other one says that they're facing the Heichal. So. Okay, so that's that. So we asked this question. Here it says that they were facing the Heichal. So it answers lo kasha. Kan bizman sheYisrael sim mitzano shemakam. Kan bizman she'en Yisrael sim mitzano shemakam. So the Rashbam explains it like this. So actually, before we get to the Rashbam on this, so what do you think that means? Before we look at the Rashbam, so we have two tenuchot, right? We have two possible positions. We have the Kruvim. Now we're talking about the name of Shlomo, and there are these big Kruvim, and based on the end of the previous part of the sugya, what we end up with the answer of Rav Ashi, to remind us, the Gemara was concerned that this idea that the bodies of the Kruvim must have stood by way of a nace, meaning somehow they were there and they weren't there. So that's challenged, and the last challenge is Rav Ashi, and I'll just point out to you, so Rav Ashi is the last of these, like chronologically, he's the last one. You may know Rav Ashi was considered to be the main editor of the Talmud Bavli, and generally in halacha, whatever Rav Ashi says is halacha, because there's a general rule in halacha that halacha kebat rai. Halacha is like the last ones. That is, are you familiar with this concept, kebat rai? No. So there's this idea, this is an interesting point, I'll just digress for a moment. So of course we know Mishnah and Gemara full of machloket. And when we come to Paskin Halacha, based on what we learn in the Gemara, we have different rules that will guide how to Paskin. So there's a kind of I want to say paradox. Maybe it's an irony. It's a kind of a paradox that we say that the samchut, the authority, the authority is mainly in the hands of the Tanaim. And the way we understand that is that after the time of the Tanaim, at the time of Rebbe, at the time of the redaction of the Mishnah and the Braitot that don't make it into the Mishnah, that from there on, the next generations of the Amoraim, and certainly after that, are no longer in a position to argue with Tanaim. And their machloket is going to be will always have to be based, whatever opinions they express, are going to have to be based in Tanaitic literature. So that gives a kind of a precedence to the earlier generations of Tanaim. However, when we talk about psak halacha, what we say is halacha kebatrai. Halacha is going to be like the later ones. The last people who are mentioned in a sugya chronologically, the later ones logically, halacha is going to be like them. And the reasoning is that they saw whatever discussion preceded them, and they decided one another. So it's not that they're somehow more important Tanaim, or not even that they're more important than your generations of Amoraim, But it's this idea that they took everything, they took all the information that preceded them in the balance when they made their decision. And to some degree, that's true now. That is, we generally hold that halacha is like, more recent halachic opinion, because whoever is paskening today is somebody who, their posek, knows all the opinions that preceded them, or certainly all the relevant opinions that preceded them, and then they have to come to a decision. So it's not that they're somehow more important or have a greater authority than the previous generations, maybe even the opposite, but they're in the position now, they in that moment they have to make this decision. So we rely on their decision. So this is a bit of a digression, important halachic concept. So Rav Ashi is Basrai. He's really the end of the end. I will also mention in another sidebar that there are Amoraim that appear after Rav Ashi, because we have Mar Bered Rav Ashi, we have his son, Mar, who also appears. And in Sechta, we have apparently Rabbanim who were no longer considered to really be Amoraim, that they were probably from the first traditions of the Saboraim, which we Gedolim after the Amoraim, whose opinions got pushed into, or redacted into copies of the Gemara. This gets into technical stuff, and I'm not an expert, but there are places where much later Rabbanim show up in the text of Gemara. So we know that the Gemara didn't apparently get redacted in quite the same way that the Mishnah did, because when the Mishnah is finished, it's really finished. And yes, we have Kilufei Girsa'ot in the Mishnah, and here and there, sometimes a Braita is appended to Mishnah, like the whole last parak of Avot is all Braita. In fact, if you look in the Rambam's Avot, he doesn't even have it. It's just a Braita. But nonetheless, it got appended into the copies of the Mishnah. And there's also a Braita at the very end of Sota, very famous Sota that got appended. Those are sort of exceptions to the rule. But in the Gemara, it would seem like in this generation of Rav Ashi, there was this attempt to do a reduction, but it apparently didn't come all at once and stay just in that generation. And so later generations felt like they could still append, or they could somehow modify it. That's how I understand this. Okay, those are all sidebars, and maybe I'm digressing because I'm so tired, and I apologize, but I think these are all important things anyway. The reason I'm pointing all this out, though, is to say that when we got, so even though here, this is not really a halachic sugya per se, right? We're talking about more agadic issues. Although you could argue that it's going to be important for us to know how quickly all these things for when we build Bayit Shli. These things will be relevant at some time in the future, and we're going to need to know how they were done. We don't know that when we build Bayit Shlishi, if we're going to have the same phenomenon of the Kruvim being there and not being there, but we would want to know how they're standing. And we would also want to know which Kruvim are we going to be using. Are we going to do we have to now make a new but we don't have the luchot? So what happens with that? Or are we depending on finding the aron, which is a discussion in a few places in the Gemara about exactly what happened to the aron. ultimate. I was thinking of going into that, but certainly not tonight. All right, but nonetheless, even though this is not in a sense halacha l'maaseh, it's not practical halacha, but when I go through this whole sugya, then I might tend to say, I'm going to conclude the sugya based on Rav Ashi. And so Rav Ashi's conclusion is that you have two kruvim that are standing next to each other, whose bodies do take up space, and there is a distance between their wings that's taken up the width of their body. But the way they're going to fit into this space is that their hands are going to overlap. So according to the Rashbam, right? The their hands are going to overlap. So now, Zekol Tov Yafeh. Now I have this other problem. So let's say, but nonetheless, I still now need to know how exactly how were they facing? How were their faces facing? So I have the pasuk in Divrei Hayam, in Bayit Shel Shlomo. These kruvim that we've been talking about the whole time are facing toward the Heichal. And I have this other pasuk though from the Mishkan that says they were facing each other, and the assumption seems to be, like the Rashbam says, that they should have been, in this sense of how they face, that should have been the same. Now, why should that particular prat be the same? We'll discuss that in a moment. Okay, having given all of this hakdama, now I see the Gemara answers the question by saying, okay, so I have one pasuk says that they're facing out toward the Heichal, one pasuk says they're facing each other. So it's not really a contradiction, because here is when here is when Israel is doing the will of God, and here's when Israel is not doing the will of God. So how do you understand the answer to the question? How are answering the question by making this chiluk? First of all, how do you understand what it means? Like, what does it mean? What does it mean? Here is when Israel is doing the will of God. Okay, but how are they facing? If they're doing the will of God, how are they facing? And if they're not doing the will of God, how are they facing? Which of those goes with which position? That's the first question.
I
Yeah,
would
can I actually?
Michael Schwartz, what were you going to say?
Sorry, we have the same name. I would have said that when they're facing each other, it's when we're doing the will of Hashem. But in thinking about it, I don't know why. I don't know why that would be. There's nothing that says that it should be like that. You could argue the other way. They turned into themselves. They turned away from us when they're looking at each other. That may be a better way.
Okay, so what you're saying is it's not really clear which one goes to which. Michael Werner, what did you want to say?
Pretty much the same. I mean, something that one could make plausible arguments in both directions.
Okay, do you want to add to that? Like, do you want to say how you would make an argument in each direction?
Well, I mean, I can think of a few different examples. So we could say that when Bnei Israel doing the will of their maker, there's peace, ben adam lehavaro, therefore they're facing each other. Or we could say that when Bnei Israel are doing the will of the maker, then they're having an encounter face to face with God's agents. So therefore, they're facing outwards, or yada yada. I can keep coming up with new arguments, and I don't know.
Okay, but so that's reasonable. So this is our first question. our first question, and then, okay, so let's say let's say one is one and one is the other. So let's just say the bisman Yisrael osim ritzono shel makom, let's say that's when they're facing one another. We'll take an example. And here is when Israel is not doing the will of God, and that's when they're outward toward the Heichal. So what is what reality is that describing? How do we understand that? It's the same kruvim. So what does the Gemara mean? Oh, they're facing each other when Israel's doing the will of God, and they're facing outward, they're not doing the will of God. So what do we that they actually moved, that the faces would have moved. And this would indicate that this is yet another nace. This is some other miraculous thing that happens by divine will that's reflected in the way the kruvim are facing. It's a reflection of the state of Yisrael as a whole. We're looking at Yisrael now, as it were, as a single body of people, right? It's like a single unit. And when Yisrael are osim shemakom, it's going to make the kruvim face each other, and shelo, then they're not facing each other, they're facing outward. Let's see how the Rashbam explains. He says, "Kan bizman Yisrael osim ritzono shemakom." He says, "Ein lofchim pneihem zeh lazeh." So he opts for this first option that we said, that when Israel is doing the will of God, then they turn their faces toward one another. It's like a male and a female who love each other, going to face each other. And I think it's similar to, I don't remember which Michael said it, maybe Michael Schwartz. That's good. Whatever, both of you, right? The idea that there's peace, like, Bein Adam L'Chaveiro, is now intimately linked with the idea of Osin Ritzono Shamakom. Siman Shakadosh Baruch Hu Ohev et Yisrael. So when they face each other, the way a man and a woman would face each other love out of affection, that's symbolic of the way Kadosh Baruch Hu loves Israel. And when does Kadosh Baruch Hu love Israel? When they're doing His will, when they're fulfilling His will. Panim el panim, and this is how they were made to begin with. In other words, in the Torah, when Moshe is commanded to make the kaporet with the kruvim, this is how they're described, that they're face to face. Kadesh tashresh Shechina Israel, in order that the Shechina should dwell in Israel. Yisrael ya'asu ritzono shamakom, and that Israel will do the will of God. Because she'eno sin, and when they don't do the will of God, hofchim pneihem lebayit al yedei nes, they're going to turn their faces toward the Heichal by way of a miracle. So this is, again, it's a reflection of another miracle. This idea of there are many interpretations of the kruvim, both in Chazal and later Meforshim. And this is one of the concepts that they are like Zachar and Nekeva. Rashbam is not the first one to say this. They're like Zachar and Nekeva, and when they're facing, so notice the careful wording here in the Rashbam. So the Rashbam is saying, so the idea was to begin with, in other words, what causes what? So is it that the way the kruvim face is caused by the actions of Israel, or the actions of Israel caused by the Levim face. So he's saying that the way the Mishkan is set up, the way that are put in the Mishkan, they're designed in such a way as to, if not to cause, but promote the idea, and this is my addition, it promotes the idea that Israel should look at each other the way a man and a wife look at each other. That will cause the Shekhinah to dwell in Israel, and that Israel then will do the will of God. Right? So the indication is that the Mishkan is set up in such a way as to promote this kind of behavior, to do the will of God. And the implication therefore, when Shlomo makes the Kruvim in Beit Shel Shlomo, he doesn't set it up in a way that necessarily that will be the outcome. The way he set up, right? In other words, so I want to point out that the way I'm understanding this is our problem is not the pasuk in Shmot per se. When we read the pasuk in Shmot and we are imagining the way the Mishkan was built, so we understand this is how the Kruvim were made, and they were made in such a way that they're looking at each other. Our problem comes about when we read Divrei Hayamim and we see that Shlomo says, or in Beit Shel Shlomo, they're described as Pneihem Labayit. And like the Rashbam says, but we would have thought that that the Kruvim's facing, right, the way they're facing should be the same as in the Mishkan. So it indicates already that something has changed spiritually in Beit Rishon that was different than Dor HaMidbar and the Mishkan, and maybe for all the hundreds of years of the Mishkan, that which is an interesting discussion unto itself, but at least the way the Mishkan is designed, it's designed in this way that l'chatchila, the Shekhinah should dwell among Israel, and that Israel should be doing Ritzono Shel Makom. Now, we know actually that didn't happen, maybe had been desired, right? Because Bnei Israel don't always do Ritzono Shel Makom, even during the time of the Mishkan, the Hefech, right? We have many, many instances of Avodah Zarah, of different rifts in the nation, where there's even wars between some tribes. But nonetheless, that's the a priori design. The design is designed in that way. When we get to the time of now, the design changes and it allows for a possibility of the way the Kruvim are faced to reflect the relationship that Bnei Israel has with the Kadosh Baruch Hu at a given time. So that's the answer to this kasha. So the answer to the kasha, according to the person who says that, the Kruvim were facing each other in Beit Shel, right? That in Beit Shel Shlomo, how does he understand when the pasuk that actually describes Beit Shel Shlomo says Pneihem Labayit? So the way he answers is to say Pneihem Yishal Afiv. That in fact is what happened. That these Kruvim that had their wings spread up, and their bodies apparently were turned toward the Heichal. But when Bnei Israel was doing Ritzono Shel Makom, their heads would turn toward each other. And when they weren't doing Ritzono Shel Makom, then their heads would turn back toward the Heichal. So that's the first, right? So that's one answer, right, to this stira. Now this, I theoretically, the Gemara could have stopped and said, okay, and that's what I will say too, right? In other words, both in theory, both Amoraim could have given the same answer, right? Because one says that they're facing the Heichal, one says they're facing each other. So they could both say the same thing. Okay, like we agree. But we know that that's not the case because we know that they argue, right? Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar, Chanamar Pnehem Yishalachi, B'Chanamar Pnehem L'Bayit. One of them understands that Pnehem L'Bayit seems to be the default. One of them says Pnehem Yishalachi, that seems to be the default. So we know that they're not going to give the same answer because they fundamentally disagree. So now we come to the second daya. Ulaman d'amar pneihem l'bayit. So according to the Man d'Amar who says that the Kruvim were facing the Hechal, aktiv pneihem yishal achiv, right? So we still have the same stira. He still has to answer this. So he answers like this. So the Gemara answers this to mitzadadi atzdude. So the Rashbam explains to mitzadadi atzdude tzat labayit u'tzat zelazeh. They turn the side a little toward the heichal and a little toward each other. In other words, they're not completely facing the heichal and they're not completely facing each other. They're like, if this would be the head-on and this would be the facing, they're kind of like this. Something like.
That's actually what I meant before when I spoke of the diagonal.
Oh, okay. All right. So then okay. Because you said they were at a diagonal, and I thought you meant what we said earlier, that they're all together at a diagonal. I accept that. The say that tzat lebayit u'tzat zelazeh, kashim medaber el chavero, like a person speaking to a friend. V'hofech rosho k'tzat l'tzad acher. Two people are speaking, but maybe one of them is going to turn a little to the side. Okay, so before we get to the rest of the Rashbam, how does that answer the question? What was our question and what's the answer?
The question is, if they're facing the fight, they're facing out, how can it be reconciled with the suit from Shemot where it says they're facing each other?
Okay, and so what's the answer?
The bodies may not be facing each other, but the heads do by being turned a little.
Say it a little bit. Say it again.
I moved away. So the bodies may be facing outside, but their heads are turned a bit to each other.
Their heads are turned somewhat to each other. In other words, the way the answer, this answer is saying, his answer is saying that the heads are fixed. They're in a fixed position. And they are in a way they are both looking at each other and looking at the heichal.
The heads actually don't turn. They're always like that, as opposed to the previous case.
Right, they're always like that. So right, in the first one, there's this idea that sometimes they'll be like this and sometimes they'll be like this. And this is saying, no, they're going to be, like Michael Werner said, they're going to be at an angle. They'll be at an angle so that they could both looking and not looking at each other, looking and not looking at the heichal. And the Rashbam says like this is, he brings this idea like from everyday life. This is like the way people to each other. They don't necessarily always look head straight at each other. They could be looking a little bit side. And so now he adds, he says, so now he's going to address this question brought up. Why don't we just say that this Manda Amar gave the same answer? We could give the same answer as the first Manda Amar. We could just say, okay, kan, kan bizman she'osim tzono shemakam, kan she'en Yisrael osim tzono shemakam. So he answers like this. He says, here you can't answer the same way that was answered earlier. Kan bisman she'Yisrael osim v'chule. You can't give that answer. Because the fundamental way that the kruvim were made was that they were facing the bayit. In other words, because that's what the pasuk says in Divrei Yamim. That's the pshuto shel mikra, ufnehem labayit. So they were made to face the bayit. Lo hayalehem lasoto l'siman she'ein Yisrael osim l'tzono shemakom. So wouldn't make sense for Shlomo to have made the kruvim l'chata in a way that indicates that Yisrael is not doing the will of God. That is, the Rashbam explained a moment ago when he's answering the first Mandamar, that l'chatchila, the way the kruvim in the Mishkan were made, they were made in order to indicate that Yisrael are doing Ritzono Shemakom. And that will promote that kind of behavior, and that's what will cause the Shekhinah to dwell amongst the Jews, or to dwell amongst Bnei Yisrael. So, if I say that l'chatchila, that the kruvim were made to not face one another, actually to face only toward the Heichal, then I'm saying that Shlomo went out of his way to indicate that Yisrael is not doing Ritzono Shel Makom. So that doesn't seem to make sense, right? That should be something that should be promoted l'chayla. So rather, what we're going to understand is that there's no contradiction between the two psukim. In the first answer, we say, yes, the two psukim are actually indicating two different realities. One where they're looking at each other, and one where they're looking at the Heichal. And it's going to change based on the behavior of Bnei Yisrael. In the second answer, he's going to say, no, l'chatchila, they were made in such a way that they are both facing the Heichal and facing each other. So zeh hakol tov yafeh. So then, but now conceptually, and so then, as I said, it indicates, according to Mandamar, who says, the Mandamar says, B'nehem l'bayit, meaning that now in Bayit Shel Shlomo, the kruvim are made l'chatchila in such a way that they are both facing Bayit and facing each other, right? So they're somewhat at an angle toward each other. So what does that indicate about osim l'shemakam or lo osim l'shemakam?
Nothing.
So one possibility is nothing, but then we have to ask the question, why? So why were they made that way? Actually, if you say to me, I don't know that either, you'd be right. In other words, I might say there's not sufficient information here to answer that question. But based on what we learned in the Teruts, about Osin or Lo Osin Ritzono Shemakom, maybe now I can also say something about this, that they're made l'chatchila to be at an toward each other. That's, by the way, that's what I'm assuming, because I could also say one is like this and one is like this, or one is like this and one is like this. But no, I think no, you'd still have to say that they're like this, because you have to be mikayim both psukim, that they're Pneihem Isha Lachiv and Pneihem Lebayit. So you have to be like this. So if the way they're facing indicates something about the behavior of Bnei Israel, what would it indicate? That they're like this?
In the first opinion, they were made face to face in order for the Shekhinah to dwell, which would cause Bnei Israel to do the will of Hashem. Here, it's either way. It's almost as if it's now the people's action, Bnei Israel's action, deciding whether Hashem will face them or not.
Yeah, something like that. That is, now that it's like this, and this is a fixed position, this is somehow a reflection of the reality of Bnei Israel. That I could imagine the faces being like this, and it would be like a perceptual thing. If you're looking at them, do you think they're looking at each other, or do you think they look away from each other? And so that perception, I don't have to have them actually move their heads to have the perception that it could be either way. And the fact that it could be either way seems to represent a reality in Bnei Israel, which is it could be either way. And I don't know if we'll have time to, we're not going to have time to look, but there is this idea that when Shlomo built his temple, that despite psukim that seem to indicate otherwise, that he knew that it's not ultimately going to stand. He knew that ultimately it was going to be destroyed. And by setting up the kruvim in this way, it's an indication that things could go either way, that Bnei Israel could be either way at any given moment. Let's just finish off the last part of the sugya. So those are the two deot, and those are the two terutzim. But as a continuation of this second terutz, right? It says haktiv ufnehem ish leachiv umadam ufnehem labayit haktiv ufnehem ish leachiv ish achiv. As the Gemara answers, the mitzadadi atzdude ditanya, because we learn in a bright time. Uncle Samar, kruvim aset tzatzuim hem, umitzudadim pneihem ketalmid haniftar merabo. So the kruvim were masatzuim, and their faces were turned to the side. The student who's departing from his master. So what's the proof from the Braita? What is the Braita brought for? What's the key word in the Braita for our purposes?
Mitzudadim.
Mitzudadim. In other words, I see that Umar says, where he says, Kruvim aset tzatzuim hem, he's basically quoting this pasuk that in Direi Yomim that describes the Kruvim as tzatzuim. And he goes on to say, Mitzudadim pneihem. that their faces were turned. Ketalmira niftar merabo. So the main thing is to say that this Manda Amar has a source. He seems to have a source in a Braita from Unclus, that the faces of the Kruvim of Shlomo were turned to the side. They were somehow at a side angle, maybe a 40-degree angle. I don't know exactly, but something like that. Mitsudadim Pneihem. And the example is, what does it mean, Mitsudadim Pneihem? They're like a Talmid that's departing from his master. Okay. Let's look at the Rashbam Hatzatzu. Pasuk hu bekruvim b'divrei hayamim, because we know that pasuk. Hu lashon tza'atza'im, klomar tinokot. Right? The language is the language of tza'atza'im. Here it's spelled with an ayin, but I think the Rashbam here is going along with the other Meforshim who preceded him, that it's like tza'atza'im with an aleph, klomar tinokot, that is to say, like children. K'damran, my kruv, kirav yeled. Right? The Gemara says in Sukkah, when it says what is a kruv? What does the word kruv mean? Kiravya. Kruv is kiravya. It's like a child. Ravya is a child. Klomar kitinokot niftarim me'rabotehem. It is to say they are like children. That is, why does Unclus Ager quote the pasuk Maseh Tzatzuim? He wants to say that they are like children, in the sense children who are departing from their masters. Which means we're turned away partially, like we said previously, like we did earlier. Now, not everybody likes the Perush of the Rashbam here, but I think because it's 9 o'clock, we'll leave it. We have a reading in the Sugya. So next week I want to look a little bit more. I'll tell you now, if you want, you can take a look. You might want to look at the Malachim Aleph Perek Chet, which is essentially a continuation of this description of the temple, and it does also talk about, especially the first part where it talks about the Kruvim and the Aron, and then parallel to that is the in Divrei Hayamim, and it'll be Divrei Hayamim Bet Perek Hey, where it's also which is the parallel psukim there. I'm going to talk about one of the things that we haven't taught yet at all is we've talked many times before about this idea that the Hell and the Kodesh HaKodeshim are separated by this wall. We didn't talk about how you enter from the Heichal into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, but we'll talk about that next. You can read a little bit about it here, and you look at Rashi, and we're going to look at it a little bit more, and then from there, I haven't decided what we're going to do after we look at these psukim yet. So I may prepare another sugya to go along, which if I do enough in advance, I will send to you. So that's it for, and yeah. Any last questions or comments? Michael Werner, are you still with us?
I'm still here, sit with you.
Okay. All right, so I apologize for misunderstanding you before.
I wasn't terribly clear.
Okay, but if that's what you meant, then, yeah, so you will like this, the Gemara's answer. Very good. Okay, so Laila Tov.
All right, thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.